Thank you for coming to today's meeting. Today we're going to discuss how to create a business report. We're going to cover several different topics, including defining the scope of the report, gathering data, determining the optimal format, interpreting the data, and how to disseminate the report. Those are the main steps that you'll need to take when you're creating your report for business. Now, it doesn't really matter what kind of business or size of business or really what decision this report is going to help you do. Going through each and every one of these steps every time is going to be very beneficial for you. So let's get in and look at each of these steps in a little bit more detail, starting with defining the scope of the report. So the scope of the report needs to answer each of these four questions. And the first question is really the most important. This one will really take the most time to define. Now, if you're a sole proprietor or a manager or someone who is asking for this report or needing this report, you're going to be the one who really determines the answer to the first question of what business decision will this report help make? Sort of the why does this report exist kind of question. Defining that out can really help you make sure that your report is doing what you need it to. In addition, if you have an analyst or someone else who's going to be generating the report and helping with that, it can really help them to really narrow in and focus on the point that's really important here. So you want to spend a lot of time with answering that question of what business decision is this report going to make? Like, why does it exist? And that is also under that idea of like, why is this report needed, right? They work really hand in hand with one another. But the corollary, the follow-up question you want to ask yourself is there a different report? Is there some other set of data that can help do this same thing? Or maybe you already have that data, or it's in a different report. So again, right, you want to just do that quick check, like, are we doing work just to do work, or does this already exist somewhere else in the business? You definitely want to define who your audience is, right? So who will use this report? Your reports are going to look different depending on who it's being generated for, right? If you're just generating the report for yourself, right, it's going to be less formal and easier, less polished than if you're reporting out to someone who, is really your customer, if you will, within the business. And then you do want to just make sure you've also defined just how often this report will be generated. Is this a one-time thing that you're looking at going, expanding somewhere, so you're going to generate it one time? Is it something that is going to be used over and over and over again to check, your business practices or those other things? So definitely figure out how often that report's going to be generated so everyone knows, and you all have your own commitments there. Now, once we have that scope defined, right, what the question is, how often it's going to be done, we can move on to the next part, which is talks about gathering data. Right, and so for this, obviously you're going to need reliable sources. And when you look at reliable sources, you want to think, am I going to be looking at primary or secondary sources? Right, primary source would be data that you've gathered yourself, or is this going to be a broad spectrum overview of data that other people have gathered, or looking at journal articles or the like? So what sources of information are you going to utilize for this report? The next question around those sources, right, if they're primary or secondary sources, right, they could either be quantifiable or qualitative sources. Traditionally in business, you want to use the qualitative sources to sort of guide where you want to go, but really business decisions are often made off of that quantifiable. right? Those are those hard numbers, the way that you know what it is, right? Oftentimes in all businesses, whether it's schools or communication companies or the frozen yogurt stand, you want to be data driven, because when you're data driven, you actually know what's going on. And then, as you're gathering this data, you just want to take a second to know what that format of it coming in is, because that's going to lead directly to our next part here about the format of the report, right? So how are you gathering the data? And how are you going to be able to then take that data and generate it into a report? So depending on the data you get, you're going to pick a format for that report. Now, there are lots of different formats you can pick. Oftentimes they're going to involve graphs or other things. It might be a scatter plot, it might be a word cloud, depending on the kind of data you have. But you need to figure out how you want to present that data. There's a couple things that your report should have. First of all, it needs to have some way of looking at a quick glance, right? So what is, when I look at the report, when I open it up, how can I visually see the story that your report is telling me? It needs to also have that ability to dig deeper in, right? Once I get the headline, now where's that meat? If I want to really investigate things, I need to have that available, because it needs to be able to stand up to scrutiny, because in business, you're going to have scrutiny given to your reports. And then, in that format, just make sure the charts aren't deceptive, right? We want to have that visual cue, but you just need to do that check of, are my scales making sense? Does it accurately portray that picture? So once you have a format, you'll need to make sure that it's right for interpreting the data, right? And so in that interpretation of the data, you should be highlighting the meaningful data to your audience, right? So, for example, if your report's on order entry errors, you would talk about, right, something like 40% of the errors are traced to 5 workers. That's really helpful, that's meaningful, that's actionable for your audience. Right, especially here, you can also, in the report, depending on the setting and the culture of your business, draw conclusions from it. Normally, business reports will have those sorts of conclusions, right? Like, what improvements should we make, or should we expand our business into this area? Also, an executive summary is the place that this is normally found. The quick highlights for the customer, the recipient of the report. And depending on what this interpretation comes in at, you may then go back and re-look at that last step of determining the optimal format. So depending on how that data comes out, you may decide later on that this format needs to change because of these conclusions that I really want to highlight. So these two steps work together. Finally, we need to talk about how to disseminate the report, right? Know your audience. If it's going to the C-suite at your company, it's going to be different than if you're projecting it out over social media. Now, if you are going out to social media, you're going to want to make sure that your data that you're putting out there follows all of those good points of social media, right? That it has some sort of attention grabber, so a chart, a picture, a meme, something like that, and that it really matters to that end user. People don't engage in social media when you're just telling your story. They want to be receiving things from that. So, right, make sure you're using pictures. Call to actions are great things to do with that. So, ways of, come in for this great sale we're having, It's time to go do this next step. And finally, videos can also be really helpful there. So as we look through all of the topics that we've covered today, defining the scope, gathering our data, determining the optimal format, interpreting the data, and disseminating the report, you should now be able to execute a well put together and thought out business report. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll take any questions that you may have now.